In this video, a 60 plus year old senior, is going to build his first edit PC. So we're going to take all of this and make it into this. But before we do that, a few things I need to talk about. One, I have built edit systems before. I just have never built my own edit PC. Built this one in the mid 1990s, cost about $100,000, and no, my budget is nowhere near that number. But in building this system, I learned a few things, questions that you should ask. What is it that you're trying to achieve by building the system? What's available to help you achieve these things? What's your budget? And can the thing you want to build be built? Now, currently, I do have an edit PC that I bought back in 2010. It's an HP 170T. It has an Intel 860 4-core hyper-threaded 2.8 gigahertz processor, 8 gigs of RAM, and at almost 10 years old, it's starting to show its age. So when I'm working in Premiere, HD material sometimes bogs down. This has gotten to the point where it's interfering with projects that I need to get done for my clients. Therefore, I needed to upgrade to a system that could handle today's workload and stuff in the future. I looked around at what was available. Puget Sound makes a great system that I could just buy, but at $4,600, we were way over my budget of only $2,000 or so. In exploring the different components that are out there, I saw that I could build a system for about $2,000, so I decided to go that route, even though I've never built a system before. Once I decided I was going to build my own edit system, I needed to pick the components. First thing I needed to decide on was the processor. I knew I was going to be using Premiere Pro, which uses CPU power, but I was also going to look into maybe switching over or at least using DaVinci's Resolve, which tends to rely a little bit more on the graphics card. That led me to the Intel i9 9900K. K is for overclocking, and it also includes a built-in graphics chip. And even though I'm getting a graphics card, should my graphics card go out, I'm at least able to have a backup graphics card on the chip that I could temporarily use. Now, I could have gone with the Ryzen 9, the 3900X chip. It's about $50 or so more than what I paid for the Intel, and it's actually a better chip if you're working with red footage. I predominantly am working in H.264, which the Intel excels at. So I went with the Intel. Having done so, that sort of dictates the kind of motherboard that I need to find. My motherboard has to have a Z390 chipset, an LGA 1151 socket to accept that Intel chip, and I chose a form factor of ATX, which is the large motherboard, and it's going to take a DDR4 memory. I finally ended up selecting the ASRock Z390 Taiyachi. It includes 8 USB ports on the I/O, 3 Ultra M.2 slots, which are great because you can use those as hard drives. Built-in Wi-Fi, didn't think I was going to use it, actually am using it. It has PCIe steel slots, which are great to block out interference, and it includes dual LAN. With the motherboard selection out of the way, it was time to select some memory. I knew I could go with up to 4 sticks of DDR4. I originally started at 2400, but then the price started shifting on memories, and 3200 became a better deal, so I went with that. I didn't populate it with 64 because 32 was plenty for the software I was running, and an additional 32 is just going to cost me money, and I wasn't going to get any real performance out of it. So I decided I could buy that at a later time should the hardware and software require it, which it doesn't at this point. As far as brand, I went with Micron's Ballistic Sports gaming memory only because it was the cheapest one I could find. Hopefully you're noticing that each component narrows down the field for the next component. Now I have to pick a computer case, and this computer case will tell me what type of graphics card I can fit into it and what type of cooling system I can use. My specifications call for a mid-tower that has 2 5 1/4 slots, one for a card reader and another for an optical drive, and I'm looking to have 4 USB ports up front. In looking at the few cases that meet my requirements, I ended up with the Cooler Master 500. While having a glass side was not my preferred choice, it was the only option I could choose from. It seems that mid-towers have grown a lot in the last 10 years, as you can see by the side-by-side comparison. Looking on the side of the cardboard box the case came in, it states it can accommodate a cooler height of 190 millimeters. The Noctua NH-D15 comes in at 165, giving me a clearance of 25 millimeters. It's also compatible with the Intel chip that I'm using, and with its 6 heat copper pipes going into a dual tower, which have 2 140 millimeter fans, that should be plenty to keep that chip cool. Why not liquid? Well, one, I don't care for liquid inside a computer, but two, in this configuration, I didn't see that liquid cooling had any advantage over air, so I opted to stay dry. Regardless of which system you choose, just make sure that it clears the RAM. In the case of the Noctua, you can actually adjust the fan height so that it clears the sticks of RAM. At this point, you can either go with a graphics card or pick your storage. I decided to pick my graphics card. And looking around, I wanted to go with an NVIDIA. A Quattro is really what you should use if you're going to do editing, but they're expensive. So a step down is the RTX 2060 Super, which comes with 8 gigabytes of memory versus 6 for the RTX 2060 Non-Super. With the PCI Express interface, it does virtual reality, which I don't care about. Port-wise, it has DVI, HDMI, 2 display ports, and 1 USB-C output. Other features of the car are its tensor cores, which are new to this line, and RT cores, which aren't being really utilized at this point, but in the future may. They definitely do make an impact if I end up working with DaVinci, but for Premiere and After Effects at this point, nominal increase, nothing really to brag about. Oh, I almost forgot. The card fits in the case. Its height is 112 millimeters, which is 4.4 inches, and the length is 228 millimeters, which is 9 inches. Now we come to storage, and I thought that was going to be real simple. I knew I wasn't going to get a hard drive because while they're extremely cheap these days for the amount of storage you can get, they're slow, and I wanted something faster. That pointed me into the area of the Samsung Evo SSD cards, and I was about to order those when I saw this guy.
Hello and welcome to Tech Deals. Which NVMe SSD drive should you buy?
So in looking at the Samsung 1 terabyte 860 Evo, it was about $140 as of the making of this video, whereas the same capacity with an Intel NVMe M.2 format is only $110. As I explored the pros and cons of both storage devices, it soon became clear that Intel had it when it came to price performance. And it so happens that the motherboard has 3 of these slots, so I ended up getting a 1 terabyte for the OS and programs, and then a 2 terabyte for all my media and data. The Intel card is not only easy to install using no cables, but it also doesn't take up any space because it lays flat against the motherboard. We're now at the point where I need to power everything that's going inside the box. So at looking at price pickers, it gives me an estimate of how much power I'm going to need. And based on that, I can pick a power supply. I ended up with the EVGA 650P2. Chose this particular brand because I heard good things about their customer support. I also like the fact that the exhaust fan on this unit will cycle down to 0 RPMs when it's idling and not generating any heat. And the last component that I'm getting is a DVD reader-writer. And that's pretty archaic, but so am I. I still have things on DVD that I want to watch or data that I want to pull off. So for me, it's a useful device and one of the reasons I got this particular case. Brand-wise, I went with the LG. It was an OEM, so it just came in a little plastic bag. And it's plenty good for what we're using it for. Now we move on to the next step, which is assembling everything together. To start with, make sure you have an uncluttered area to work in. Get the case box, cut open the bottom, turn out the flaps, and then turn the box on its bottom. Now you should be able to lift the box, leaving behind the styrofoam and the case fully intact. This is a lot easier than trying to lift the styrofoam and the case out of the box. Once out of the box, Visually inspect for any shipping damage. Then use the handy built-in handles to get rid of the styrofoam and wrapping. The top magnetic filter may come off with the wrapping, so make sure you don't throw that away. Inside the box, you should find the warranty information and instructions. For those of you who don't like reading instructions, it's picture-based only. So please study the pictures, it's important. To open the tempered glass, turn the screw quarter turn clockwise. The glass will tilt out, but it will not drop. Lift the glass out and put it in a safe area. You won't need it until we're finished assembling the entire computer. Looking at the bottom of the case, we see that there's an area for an internal drive, and that where the power supply goes has rubber shock mounts, 4 of them, which is a very nice feature, along with built-in filters. Above that, we have places for SD cards, and throughout there are grommeted openings for cable management. The back panel has a nice cutout for the CPU to use as cooling. The drive cages can be moved up or down. There's an accessory box, and above that, 2 5 1/4 slots for external drives. The back of the unit has a pull-out filter for the power supply. The top is where the magnetic filter goes. You could also mount a liquid cooling system up there if you wanted to. To remove the remaining panel, just turn the thumb screw, pull out, and the door will drop, but it will stop. You'll need to lift it out. Again, put that in a safe place because you won't need it until after we finish building the computer. Inside we see our cables, USB, switch, lights, audio. There are 3 Velcro ties to help manage cables, plus there are various areas for cable ties. So managing cables should be fairly easy in this unit. All the corners are rounded, there are no sharp edges. The case comes with 2 140mm fans, one in the back, one in the front. Above the front fan is 2 external drive access, 4 USB drives, power supply, reset, and headphone jack. And there's a look at the 2 built-in handles. The case is designed in such a way to give you many options in how you want to build your computer. In the drive cage is the accessory box. Just press the 2 tabs together, slide it out, open up the box, and inside you will find an assortment of accessories, cable ties, a bag of screws and standoffs. Don't want to lose this. And then various brackets and electrical connections that you may or may not need. One of the nice touches is they give you a cleaning cloth for your side panel in case you don't have any in your house. Make sure not to discard the box without removing the sled because you'll need that if you're mounting a drive internally. I would advise you to get a parts bin and put all those screws there so that they don't wander off. On the inside of the case, we'll have to attach some standoffs. And the way we know where to put them is by the letters that are stamped in them. E, A, M, I. Each letter represents a different size motherboard that can go into this case. We're using an ATX motherboard, so we're only interested in the A's. If you're using a different size motherboard, information is stamped telling you what each letter represents. E is for extended ATX, A for ATX, M for micro ATX, and I for mini ITX. We're going to count all the A's, and there should be 7 of them, and then we're going to find the standoffs. Find 7 of those. They're included with the kit, along with the socket, and the socket is used to drive the standoffs into the case. You simply are going to take that socket, place it over the top of the standoff, and then grab a Phillips screwdriver and drive them into position. You want to screw the standoff until the thread is no longer visible. You can try starting these by hand. and then place the socket over it. And what I notice is they didn't smoothly turn. You're sort of forcing it a little bit. It's not very hard, but it wasn't just an easy screw it in type thing. Once the standoff is flush with the case, remove the socket and continue until you're done with all 7 standoffs. Now we go to the box that contains our motherboard, and we pull out its little suitcase, open it up, and we see all sorts of cool stuff in there. There's a CD of drivers and a AS Rock sticker. There's a little tiny M.2 screw that you'll need if you're going to use that type of format for storage. There's also a postcard, so you can send that to your grandmother, let her know that you're building a computer. In addition, there's a software setup guide and an installation guide, which is pretty thick, but it really isn't because it's just a bunch of languages in there. So each section is pretty small. And then the reason we came here for, the I/O port. We take the I/O port and we're going to orientate it so that the audio holes are facing the bottom of the case. So if we look on the outside, this is the way it'll appear. Unfortunately, we have to install it from the inside of the case. And it's only unfortunate because it's just a little awkward with the fan in the way and you're kind of just at a weird angle. And the idea here is to get it to snap into place. And the idea here is to snap it into place. A little bit of caution because there's some sharp edges on here and some bent pieces of metal that you could get caught on that you don't want to bend and you don't want to break off. So once you press in at the top and bottom, you should hear it snap into place. And there you go. That was the top and the bottom. It shouldn't move. It should be solid. Then you're set to go. Meanwhile, back at the motherboard box, there are all sorts of other goodies still there. SATA cables, antennas for the Wi-Fi, more M.2 screws that you're going to need, possibly. And once you finish digging everything out, in the basement of the case is the motherboard wrapped in static wrap. Speaking of static, I'm actually grounded with a wrist strap. I'm also wearing some gloves. I don't want to accidentally do a static discharge and fry the motherboard. You're encouraged to do this by the manufacturer, so I'm not going to take the risk. If you don't want to, that's totally up to you. Now, in addition to protecting the motherboard with the anti-static wrap, AS Rock also includes a foam wrap all the way around the edge. It's held in place by tie wraps, and you're going to need to snip those off. I'm just using a diagonal wire cutter to achieve that. With the foam out of the way, I placed the motherboard on top of the static wrap, which is on top of the motherboard box. And now I'm going to take advantage of the fact that the motherboard is still outside the case by installing a few of the components. It's much easier to add memory and storage while the motherboard is out as opposed to when it's in the case. As we mentioned earlier, our choice of memory is the ballistic. It's 32 gig kit, it's two 16 gig cards, it's DDR4 running at 3200. Here are the two sticks as they're unpacked, and we have 4 available slots. It's dual channel, so we have to go with the lower slot and the third slot in for dual channel. Make sure that the notch matches where it's going into the slot. And on this motherboard, there is only one side that pushes in, that clips in. You sort of have to get in the left side first and then push down. There's a little flexing, but that's not the motherboard flexing, it's actually the cardboard box underneath. With our 2 sticks of RAM installed, now it's time to install our storage solution. We have 3 available slots, and I've purchased 2 sticks. Oh, by the way, there's this little plastic film that you should take off the motherboard because you don't want this baking on or crinkling up inside. My storage solution is the Intel SSD 6. I bought a 1 terabyte stick and a 2 terabyte stick. One is the primary, the other one for media. Installation is very easy. You just line it up with the notch, push it in, and press down. You will need one of those M.2 screws to secure the other end of the card. Yes, they're easy to lose, so be careful with them. Just simply press down the card, attach the screw with the small Phillips, and you just want to get it snug. No sense in over tightening because you don't want to crack the board. One thing to know about the M.2 connection is that there are several screw openings available depending on the size of the card. But each of those screw openings is covered with a little piece of plastic that you have to remove before you can drive in the screw. Now for our second stick, we're going to remove the heat sink, and that has 2 simple screws that you just take off. The card is now in place. We've attached it with our M2 screw, and when we look at the heat sink, we see there's a little tape, and that needs to be removed so that the heat sink actually attaches right to the card. And with the drive card in place, you simply place the heat sink on top and then just screw it in snugly. With our storage solution in place, next thing we have to do is open up our Intel chip and unbox it. But before we go to install it, we're going to have to open up the CPU holder and look for some landmarks. And you'll see that over in the left-hand side, upper left-hand side of the screen, there's a little triangle. And that corresponds to a little gold triangle on the chip itself. And that's your alignment guide. We take our chip, align the triangle with the mark, set it down, and it should literally just drop into place. Then you close the door, bring down the arm, swing it under the retainer. You see how the case goes underneath the screw there? And I will admit I was a bit nervous, didn't want to do any damage to the CPU. And now you're going to feel some tension. And I thought, well, gee, I should move this plastic shield out of the way, but it would have popped off on its own. Put the tension arm underneath, it's locked into position, and don't touch your CPU with your bare fingers because that's where your thermal paste is going to go in the future. Save this cover and use it if you need to remove the processor sometime in the future. With CPU, RAM, and storage mounted on the motherboard, it's time to place it inside the case. We're going to align it with the I/O plate and with the standoffs of the case. You may have to jigger it around just a little bit to make sure the standoffs line up. And then we're going to get our flathead screws. I'm going to use a 1/4-inch drive, and we used 9 of those screws to secure the motherboard to the case. You can use a Phillips, but a nut driver just makes it really quick and easy. And when you're done, make sure you have 9 of them in there. Those of you with sharp eyes may notice that there appears to be an opening on the left side of the motherboard, but in fact, that does not have a standoff in it, so no screw goes in there. And while we only put in 7 standoffs, the case actually came with 2 that were already built in. We now proceed to the unboxing of the Noctua cooling system. Inside the box, you'll find the accessories kit, which includes a system for both AMD and Intel. Thus, when you open the box, you'll see a variety of mounting bars, manuals, and other peripherals. it's important that you follow the directions for your particular chipset, which in this case is the Intel 1151. A decision to be made is, how do we want to orientate the fan on the cooling system? Parallel to the back exhaust fan or perpendicular? I'm going to go with parallel. That way the heat exhausts straight out through the back exhaust fan. If I were to go perpendicular, I could use the exhaust that's available through the top of the case. Grabbing the back plate, we're going to go to the back side of the motherboard and attach it. You'll notice it has 4 pins, 2 round holes, a rectangle, and a notch at the bottom. We aligned these with the CPU backplate so that the 2 round holes go right over the 2 screw holes of the CPU backplate. This is what your orientation should look like. Then we proceed over to the other side. So on this side, you'll see the 4 pins from the backplate protruding. We'll need 4 black spacers and 4 thumb screws to secure the mounting bars. This is the orientation with the fan parallel. If we go perpendicular, it'll look more like parentheses as opposed to a smile and a frown. In this installation, we're going to go parallel to the back exhaust fan, so we get a smile and a frown on the mounting bars. Notice also that on the mounting bars, there is a pin in the center, and that's going to be facing upward. While holding the back plate with one hand, we add spacers to the protruding pins. Then we're going to add the mounting bar and the thumb screws. The thumb screws should only be hand tight. If you use the Phillips screwdriver and you drive it too hard, you're going to distort the mounting bars. Once one set of mounting bars is secure, add your 2 other spacers, the top mounting bar. You'll notice that the bars have a slot, and these will automatically adjust to the right position as you install it, so you don't have to worry about where to actually align it. Again, secure with the thumb screws, and we're done. Now we go to our cooling tower, and we have to remove the center fan. And you do that by grabbing the spring, lifting up and outward. Do the same thing for the other side, and then you should be able to lift the fan out, guide its power cable free, and lift it out of the center. You'll need to make this space available so you can actually install the unit. Be careful when removing the fan that you don't damage the fins. Now we grab our thermal paste, we unscrew the tip, and here's where we get into an area of some differences of opinion. Some people say you make an X, some say you just squirt it in the middle, you spread it out. What Noctua tells you is you put a 4 to 5 millimeter dab, that's about a 1/4 inch, in the center, and that's it. So that's what we're going to do. Adding too much thermal paste will actually decrease the cooling capability of this system. Now we go to add the tower. Make sure to remove the plastic cover off the bottom. Align the tower with the 2 pins, and then start to hand tighten. Then you can use the Phillips screwdriver. Do 2 to 3 turns on each screw, alternate, so that you get even pressure going across the chip surface until, again, they're nice and snug but not over tightened. How will you know that the screws are snug? You'll get to the end of travel. Now it's time to reinsert the center fan. Orientate the power cable where you want it to go. Bring it down, grab the spring, go out, back, and clip into the fins. Do the same thing on the other side. Now grab the remaining fan and some springs that are included with the kit, because you're going to need to attach that to the fan before you can mount it onto the tower. Orientation of the fan is with the label facing the back exhaust fan of the case. We simply stick the spring into one of the holes and make sure we go around the rubber mounts, not in front of them. You can see the orientation there. The spring goes behind the rubber mounts. Then we're going to do the same thing to the other side. Thread one side of the spring through to the back side, and then we catch the top hole. And you're fighting the spring a little bit, but that's what holds it in place. Bring your fan over the front, pull out, pull back over the fin, and it should catch. You want to be careful here that the bottom of the fan does not sit on top of the ram. You want to have a little bit of clearance. And this system is designed so that the front fan can actually ride a little higher than the back fan. With both sides of the fan secured, this is what your installation should look like. Springs are clipped into the fins. Front is slightly higher than the back, clearing the ram. As long as we're here, we should plug in the back case fan to its power header, which is located right here. The Noctua gives you two options. You can plug each of its fans into their own individual power headers, or you can use its combiner splitter so that you're plugging both fans into one header. In the end, I decided to run each of the Noctua fans into its own power header, thus enabling me to monitor the individual speed of each fan and control their speed should I desire to do so through the BIOS. With most of the components already connected, we need something to power them all. That's where the EVGA 650 P2 comes in. In opening the box, we'd see it comes with a nice little bag that you're going to use for any leftover cables. It comes with an assortment of power cables, all of which you may not need. But the thing we're looking for right now is this, the screws so we can attach the power supply to the case. Now the Cooler Master case comes with a bracket that attaches to the case, and you attach the power supply to the bracket. So first thing you have to do is unscrew all 4 thumb screws. Remove the bracket. Take your power supply. Orientation doesn't matter, it can be up or down at this point, and just attach the bracket. I'm going to use a 1/4-inch drive. Okay, let's let gravity help us here. We put the power supply on its end. And now we align the bracket face so that the holes match up with the screw holes in the power supply. Be careful because not every hole gets a screw. Now you see if you move this bracket around, it may look like a screw could possibly go there, but it won't. With all 4 screws in, and I didn't tighten them all the way down, I left them a little bit loose for now. We decided which way the fan's going to go. And in our case, the fan's going to go face down because that's where the filter is. So we slide the power supply in, get it over the mounts on the inside of the case. Then we tighten down the thumb screws. Once all 4 thumb screws have been tightened, then I will tighten the screws that hold the power supply to the bracket. Make sure the power button is in the off position. On the other side of the power supply, we see that the modular connectors are all labeled, MB for motherboard, CPU, VGA 1 and 2 in case you have a second video card, SATAs 1, 2, and 3, along with peripheral. Now you'll notice the button on the lower left-hand side. It says Eco. If you enable that button, it'll shut off the fan, and the fan won't come on unless the system needs to be cooled down, which is nice if you want to eliminate some fan noise and also save a little bit of energy. Making a connection is as simple as taking a cable with a matching name, inserting it, and making sure that the locking pin is fully inserted. Here's a view from the other side, and in hindsight, I should have just plugged in all the cables that I thought I was going to use, then inserted the power supply, because even though I have access on two sides, it was still a little hard to get those cables in. Back in the case, we see where we have to make our connection for the motherboard and also for the CPU. Here are the cables for the motherboard. You connect one end to the power supply and the other end, of course, to your motherboard. Since there are a lot of wires feeding these connectors, the connection is going to be a little stiff, and at times you're just fighting the connectors to get them into place. While determining where things need to be plugged in for power, I'm also going to connect some of the USB cables. In this case, this is a USB 3 cable that needs to be connected. That cable will either connect to this USB port or the one above it, and of course, the motherboard connection is right above that. This is what it looks like with the USB 3 connected. On the other side of the case, we see that there is a USB 2 connector that needs to be routed underneath the case and to the other side of the motherboard. Here's the connector. We look for the labeling on our motherboard and it says USB 1, 2, so we know we can plug that into that connection. And this is what that finished cable looks like once it's in. One of the nice features about this case is you have a channel with 3 Velcro straps that helps you manage some of the cabling. Here we have a cable that goes underneath the motherboard to come out on the other side. This thick cable is the HD audio, and unfortunately for us, it wasn't long enough for me to really route it with the service loop. So I'm sort of fighting the cable to get it to turn in the right direction so that we could plug it in. And that'll be an issue with the motherboard, is just getting these little connectors to go into their right location. You have to be careful not to bend a pin, break a pin, or misalign with the pins. Breaking a pin is really bad because you pretty much need to live without that function or get a replacement motherboard. Here we are with the HD audio connected, and you can see how the cable has been stressed, but I don't have any additional cable length to work with. Now we're going to connect a fan cable, and you see some of the connections are parallel to the edge of the motherboard and others are perpendicular. Some of them have guides on them to help make the connection a little easier, and in some cases it doesn't matter which way you orientate the connector. You sort of have to pay attention to what you're doing. At the same time, you're working in limited space. I would recommend maybe using a pair of tweezers or long nose pliers to help guide some of these connections into place. With some of these connections, it's important to get the polarity correct. For example, with the power LEDs, the minus and plus have to be in the correct orientation, otherwise it won't work. And this is where you pay attention to the markings on the motherboard to make sure everything's properly aligned. We have a fan connection that needs to be made from the front. We routed it to the grommet. You see there's little guides on this. There are guides on the bottom side of those 4 pins. And of course, the connector doesn't want to turn in that direction. And this is sort of the struggle that you have to go through with all these. And it's a little frustrating. Sometimes you just want to push things and get it done with, and you can't because you don't want to bend or break a pin. Of course, it doesn't help that my senior eyes can hardly see the writing on much of the motherboard. So oftentimes I was referring to the manual to make sure I was putting things in the right place. We finally make the connection. And you'll notice there's a pin exposed. Now, this connector has 3 sockets, and it's a 4-pin connection that we're going into. So in this case, it's all right to have an exposed pin. If we had a 4-pin socket, then we would be offset, which is wrong. You'd need to cover all 4. But in this case, we're fine. Anyway, you continue this process until you've fully gotten all your connections made. Can we now unbox the video card? Is it time to install the video card? No. we still have to install an optical drive. Yes, this old-fashioned guy likes optical drives, so we're putting one in. Our case provides two 5 1/4 slots, so we're going to go for the top one. Looking from the back side, you see there are two plastic tabs on either side. All we have to do is just push in that tab, and the little panel should pop off. Then you just remove it. Now, unfortunately, I don't have the rest of this video. For some reason, it didn't get recorded, but I do have the installation of a media reader, and it's the same procedure. You see these two holes? These two holes will line up with two pins that are pushed in when you slide this switch over. And that's the hard part, because it's hard to see if you've actually lined it up. In theory, all you have to do is just get this in flush, and those pins should be in alignment. Now you'll notice that the toolless connection consists of nothing more than two sliders that say either open or lock. Open when the bay is empty, locked when you actually have a device in there and you've locked it into position. The problem with these is you go to the left to lock it, but that also tends to disengage the whole thing. So you end up with this. The part literally comes off. The only good thing is that you see the spring connection, and if you push on it and you look around on the other side, you can see where the pins are protruding. Now, if you mark on your device where the holes are, you can actually align those two and make a good connection. But to get this back on, you have to place it over the face, slide it to the right. Of course, when you slide that switch to the left, it wants to come off. So you kind of have to hold this in place while you're trying to slide the button. Poor design by Cooler Master. Now we're going to grab one of our SATA power cables, and you get 3 of them with the power supply. Each is capable of handling 2 SATA devices. We plug the cable into the power supply, route it behind the case through a grommet. Then we look at the keying on it. It will only fit one way into our optical drive. And of course, the way it wants to naturally go in isn't the correct way. So you're going to have to do some twisting and turning. And there isn't much space because, of course, the Noctua is right behind you. Once in place, then we go to get the SATA data cable. This cable, as you see here, has a locking mechanism on both ends. Sometimes it's right angled, sometimes it's straight. It's also keyed, so it only fits in one way. And by the way, you do get some SATA data cables with the motherboard, so don't go out and buy more like I did. To install, I just simply put the cable straight into the optical device and then proceeded to route it through the back of the case out to where the SATA ports are. You have a total of 8 ports. Once you route it through, it's as simple as just plugging it in. We're going with number 2. Locking pin will be on top. And that's it. You push in and you're done. Now we're routing the VGA power cable because we're now going to install the video card in its appropriate slot. But before we do that, we have to unscrew these two so we can open 2 slots for the card to fit in. As we get the card into position, don't forget to remove any extraneous film that might be on the unit. We simply line up the pins, drop them in place, and then we're going to attach 2 screws at the far end to hold it down, and of course the power supply, with the locking pin of the power supply facing the same side as the fan. With that final connection made, it's time to just visually inspect and make sure that everything that gets power is plugged in and connected to the right spot. Now, before we can power up the computer, we need a monitor. I ended up with an AOC. I had looked at Dell and BenQ and a couple of others, and for the amount of features and the price range, I thought this was a great buy, had wonderful reviews, so we went with a 32-inch monitor. The folks at AOC seem to go the extra length for the customer. When you open the box, there are tons of cables in there, so chances of you having to go back to the computer store to get a cable are going to be nil. The monitor is well packed with very thick styrofoam, so chances of it getting damaged are almost nil. First thing we have to do is install the mounting arm, and it's held in by 4 screws, which have Loctite on them, which is a really nice feature. I've never seen anyone else do that except for automotive people. Bottom plate gets attached, and it's full of protective tape, which you're going to have to strip off. Bottom plate also includes this Lazy Susan type device. You'll line that up so that the ring screw, as I call it, is visible, and you'll use that to tighten the plate to the mount. And then that black circle is quite literally a Lazy Susan. When you place it on your desk, you'll be able to turn your monitor left and right. It's kind of a different approach to rotating a monitor. Included with the monitor is a USB hub with 4 ports. On the bottom side of the monitor, there are connections for headphones, audio in, VGA, DisplayPort, HDMI, and DVI. There's also a power switch and, of course, an AC connection. For a keyboard, I chose the K740 by Logitech. It's a nice illuminated keyboard. I've had one for several years, been very happy with it. When it came to a mouse, I just went with a plain old Microsoft 2-button and a scroll wheel mouse. I have 2 different versions that I use. Prefer the second one just because it has 2 additional left and rights. Finally, we plug in the keyboard, the mouse, and the DisplayPort connection from the monitor. That gives us the best resolution. We make sure power supply is on, and we hit the on button. Fan starts spinning. We don't hear beeping sounds. We hit the delete button or F2, which will get us right into the BIOS. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to set the time and date. Once that's done, we're going to go over to Tools, select Internet Flash, make sure we have an Ethernet connection, and then we're going to flash a BIOS update. Once the BIOS is updated, then you're going to check to make sure that your CPU is correctly recognized, the RAM, storage, and all your other devices. Because this is a custom build, you're going to have a lot more access to what you can do with the BIOS than something that you bought from off the shelf. So you may want to spend some time just poking around and on the internet learning more about what's available to you. Now it's time to move on to an operating system. I'm going with Windows 10 Pro, and I paid $199 for this. And I know a lot of you are saying, wow, I could get it for $10, $20, or for free. More power to you. That's not the way I roll. So I sent the money to Microsoft. And what really surprised me when I unboxed this was the thumb drive is like a 99-cent device. You know, you're paying $200. They obviously didn't put any of that money into the actual thumb drive. We plug in the thumb drive into the USB 3 port and hit restart. And you get a choice of whether you want to do a 64-bit or a 32-bit system. We're going with 64-bit. Then you're asked the language, the time and currency format, and keyboard input. This will be followed by Install Now prompt. Then you can enter your registry key. And if you don't have one, you can bypass it, and they'll ask you for one at the very end. License agreement, which of course you have to accept. Whether you want to update or just do a Windows install, we're doing a Windows install. Then you have to pick where you want to install your Windows operating system. And in our case, we have a 1 terabyte drive that's specifically set aside for that, so I choose that. It starts to copy, it gets files ready, it's installing features, it's doing updates, it's supposedly finishing up. Then it'll ask you what country, even though we answered that earlier. What keyboard, even though we answered that earlier. Do you want to add a second keyboard layout? You can skip that. Then it says it's doing more important updates. Now you'll have a choice of whether you want to set this up for an organization or for personal use. We're going with personal use. The next screen will prompt you for a Microsoft login or create an account, but you do have a third option, which is just to hit the next button and ignore that. Up to you. Then create a PIN, which is different from a password. How so? It seems to be less stringent than a password. Now, do you want to take your history across different devices? That's a yes or no proposition. I went with a no. Do you want to access your Android phone and text and get notifications? I don't want that. OneDrive, I don't want that. As a matter of fact, if you look in the lower left-hand corner, it says only save files to this PC. That's the option I went with. This is pretty much a work PC. Then if you want to try out Office 365, you can tell it yes or no, or if you have a key, you can insert a key for that. Do you want to get help from the digital assistant Cortana? No. Then there's some privacy settings, and there's a whole bunch of them in here, and I advise you to go through it. Like, advertising ID. Do you want one assigned to you? I told it no. Then it says it's getting ready because it's going to work for you really soon, but it's going to take a few more minutes. Don't turn off the computer. Finally, you get to a screen. It offers to teach you some stuff about what's going on. I kind of ignored all that stuff. It took 31 minutes from the time I inserted that USB OS until I had it running. My next step was to insert the CD that came with the motherboard, and that initiated a connection with their servers and proceeded to download drivers for all sorts of things that were on the motherboard. When completed, I was up to date. And then the next thing I did was I went over and got Firefox. Using Firefox, I went over to NVIDIA, downloaded all the drivers for that, and ended up in my full native resolution for the monitor. My experience building a PC for the first time actually went fairly well. I mean, the most amazing part was that once everything was in and we turned it on, everything worked. Nothing had to go back. Nothing had to be, I didn't have to do any troubleshooting. Things just worked. In hindsight, when I installed the power supply, I should have attached all the modular connectors that I thought I was going to use. I think that would have made that process a little easier. When ordering this Cooler Master, I should have paid a little bit more attention to the actual dimensions. Then I wouldn't have been surprised that their mid-tower was a lot bigger than my old mid-tower. I wish Cooler Master would have spent a little bit more time engineering how 5 1/4 devices get attached in the case. Their current solution is a big fail, considering how well they did with everything else in the case. Within weeks of completing this, I added a 3 1/4 media card reader to it. To date, I'm still impressed with how quiet the system runs and how cool it runs. Fan-wise, it's just the 2 stock fans, the Noctua 2 fans, the video card 2 fans, and the fan in the power supply. And that's all the cooling that the system has. In the end, I'm glad I went and built my own system, saved myself a lot of money, have a high-performing system that helps me get my edit projects done on time. And I expect, like my old HP, this one will provide many, many years of useful service. Could you build your own? Should you build your own? Anyone who's comfortable around electronics and doing research to make sure you're getting the right components, because it's real easy to mess this up and just get parts that aren't going to work together. So you have to be detail oriented. If you can do that, the actual assembly of it isn't that hard. A little cumbersome at times, and it helps to have better eyesight than me and smaller fingers, but most people can do this. If you found this video interesting, leave us a comment, give us a thumbs up, please subscribe, and as always, thank you so very much for just watching. If you want to use 2 NVMe cards, you should have 1 screw left. Label it and attach it to the inside of the box so that when you decide to add one, you know exactly where to find that screw.